After months of building tensions between Sudan's military and civilian factions, a coup. The Prime Minister is one of many arrested, a state of emergency has been imposed, and the Transitional Sovereign Council and government dissolved. So what does the road ahead look like for Sudan? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashim Ahalbarra. Many people in Sudan have been expecting a transition to democracy. It was promised by the country's generals and civilian leaders who have shared power for nearly 2 years. But that's been thrown into uncertainty following a military coup. Sudan's army declared a state of emergency, dissolved the governing council and arrested many political leaders. Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok is among those detained. Pro-democracy supporters have called for protests, setting the stage for a possible showdown with the armed forces. Internet and mobile phone services were shut down and the airport closed. Military Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan cited political infighting for the military intervention. He's pledged to hold elections as scheduled in 2023.
We dissolved the Sovereign Council and the Cabinet, and we put an end to the Mayor's jobs and Under-Secretaries and the State Governors. We'll revise everything and we'll take decisions towards everything. We urge everyone to abide by the agreement of Juba 2020. We stress and confirm that some of our people in the East have their own sufferings, and we are quite sure that justice and peace must prevail. We must work hard to reach lasting solutions for our people.
Sudan has been governed by a joint civilian-military body known as the Sovereign Council since long-time ruler Omar al-Bashir was ousted in April 2019. It was part of a power-sharing deal that included holding elections and transitioning to civilian rule. But divisions have emerged in recent months between the military and civilian leaders. Tensions grew after a coup attempt blamed on followers of Bashir was foiled in last month. Then earlier this month, supporters of the military leaders took to the streets to call on the army to take back control. Pro-democracy groups said it was an attempt by the military to retake power. On Saturday, tens of thousands of people held protests to show solidarity with the transitional government. Let's bring in our guests from Doha. We have Walid Madibo, founder and president of the Sudan Policy Forum. In Nairobi, Jonas Horner, deputy director for Horn of Africa and senior analyst for Sudan at the International Crisis Group. And over in Edinburgh, Scotland, Alex Duwall, executive director of the World Peace Foundation and research professor at the Tufts Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Thank you all for joining us. Walid, by dissolving the ruling council, the transitional government, declaring state of emergency, arresting senior government officials, including Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, what is Army Chief trying to say here?
If we decompose and scrutinize the speech of Mr. Burhan, especially if we look at Articles 11, 12, 15, 16, 24, 71, and 72 that were eliminated from the new constitutional document that he said he is ready to abide with. There are two categories here. There are 3 articles that has to do with him issuing decrees, and there is the other category which has to do with he has done away with the article that had to do with dismantling of the Islamist state and combating of corruption. And the other article had to do with, he had done away with the article that dealt with investigating the crime of June 19th, and at which point we all remember that about 1,800 protesters that were attacked using lethal weapon, and we don't know, there are some that are still missing. So if you look at him removing those two articles, those two important articles, it seems that the army was pushed to the corner since there was no discourse between the civilians and the army officers in the Sovereign Council. It seems that there was no room for compromise. It seems that the officers feared this whole thing of investigating the crime, and they didn't want to go with dismantling the Islamist state, which is going to weaken their position in power.
So you're basically saying that the military establishment is trying to prevent any prosecution in the near future, which was part of the power sharing with the civilians about the atrocities committed, and particularly those that were committed during the after 2019. Jonas, is it fair to say that all the power sharing deals and all the architecture that was started post-April 2019 are now scrapped, are now part of the past?
I don't think that necessarily has to be the case. And, you know, it's odd, up until now, there had been considerable effort from all sides in many ways to somehow stay within the norms of the Constitutional Declaration and also the Juba Agreement, even though there was very little in the way of implementation. So you know, I wouldn't say that this is entirely over, and there have been efforts even before today to broker the sort of peace and accord between the three components of this, three main components of this transition, which are the armed groups who came in after the Juba Agreement, the military and the FFC, but there have been efforts to try to put together a deal that would allow everyone to have a little bit of what they want. But what we've seen this morning is the tearing asunder of that effort. I wouldn't say these institutions are over, but they've certainly been rocked.
Alex, when you look at the announcement, so basically Abdel Fattah al-Burhan is saying that the Sovereign Council goes along with the transitional government, but the Transitional Military Council that started the coup in 2019 stays in power, which means that Abdel Fattah Burhan will remain the ultimate authority in Sudan. And he says that he will form a new government, he will also form the Legislative Council, and he will ensure that elections will be held in 2023. I mean, it could be a clear message that, you know what, you have to deal with me from now onwards.
It's a naked, brutal power grab, and no language that comes out of al-Burhan's mouth can mask the basic reality that what he is trying to do is to tear up the aspirations of the Sudanese people as expressed in the 2019 revolution. The revolutionaries, the Democrats, were ready to compromise with the military. They were ready to allow the military to retain a considerable share in power. And also very problematically, they were unable to roll back the military's control over many commanding sectors of the economy. And when they tried to do that, and when the prospect of the head of the Sovereignty Council being rotated, as was agreed from the military to the civilians in the coming months, al-Burhan said, no, he basically wants to seize power. Quite what he expects to achieve with this, other than returning Sudan to the status quo ante before the revolution, I really don't know.
Walid, do you think that the cohabitation between the civilians and the army in Sudan is over by the decision made today by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan?
Absolutely. I think except for the Islamists and some psychophants here and there, I don't think that any individual with some credibility among the Sudanese elites will be willing to work with this military junta. And if we were to critique the tactic, I mean, no one would have imagined that al-Burhan will adopt this drastic methodology, knowingly that he is just using the name of the army. It was basically the RSF, the rapid forces, that secured the areas that were sensitive and made an attempt to secure other facilities that are of critical importance to the government. It is basically the RSF that has helped Burhan succeed in his this coup d'etat. So should the coup d'etat fail due to external or internal pressure, I think there are going to be some very serious divisions within the army, at which point there is going to be some very bloody confrontation between the army and the militias that are already in Khartoum. So God forbid that this coup d'etat fail, there is going to be a confrontation between the army, which feels very much subsided, and the militias that came from abroad.
Jonas, it seems that the army and the civilians are on a collision course, but the question is, what kind of leverage does the civilian establishment have in Sudan in the near future to reverse the decisions made by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan?
Well, very few. Obviously, people have come out very speedily onto the streets to express their opposition to the military's unilateral takeover of power. And it really is, this all began with collective action in late 2018 and moving into 2019 and delivered, the inspiring and pretty historic removal after 30 years of Omar al-Bashir. So, those tactics have worked before. They also relied heavily on non-violence, which confounded the military in many ways. And so, along with collective action and a return to some of the proven structures, such as the Sudanese Professionals Association, there's also a need for a real championing of the sorts of messaging and the causes that the people on the streets are going to want to see. They have also avoided quite clear leadership throughout the revolution, and they may pursue this approach again. Especially given that the talisman for the revolution to date, however strong or weak he may have been, Abdallah Hamdok, the prime minister, has been ghosted away.
Alex, I mean, it was not a secret at all that the military takeover was just going to be a matter of time. You look at the protests, pro-military protests that were choreographed by the establishment. You look at the statements made by the military following the attempted coup last month. But the question is, why would al-Burhan go for these drastic measures when he knows that no one in the international community, the main backers, the main donors, reject military takeovers?
That is the big puzzle. The one legitimate criticism that he may have had of the civilian government was that it had failed to deliver on the promise of economic stabilization. The economic crisis in Sudan remains dire. And that's actually very largely the responsibility of the international donors, who are very, very slow in providing the necessary assistance to stabilize Sudan. But they have been doing that. Over the last few months, we have had debt rescheduling, debt relief, the lifting of the state sponsors of terror designation, the beginnings of economic normalization. And that can be credited to the civilian leadership, and especially to Abdallah Hamdok. Now, there is no chance that the United States, the European Union, the World Bank, etc., are going to come in and say, oh, we don't mind having the democratic transition torn up. The other option that the al-Burhan might have is to get some cash in hand from the Saudis and the Emiratis. But that is not true either. And it's striking that the Arab League came with a statement that didn't just call for dialogue, but called for a return to the constitutional agreement of 2019. And I think it's not likely that the Arab League would have got very much out of step with the Egyptians. So it is quite unclear to me where possible foreign financial support for al-Burhan's putsch is going to come from.
Walid, we've seen all those statements coming from the US, from the EU, from different key players denouncing the decisions made by al-Burhan. But do you think that this could be translated into sanctions targeting the military regime?
It's unclear. If we investigate the geographic landscape, I think al-Burhan would not have attempted this coup d'etat without getting approval from the Egyptians or from UAE. But if you look at the situation of Sudan, it's a country that's trying to make a transition to democracy, and it's in the midst of a region that is dominated by autocrats. They don't like democracy, but they do have a distaste for Islamists. So it's not clear if Burhan is just going to, in the absence of any political and social grounding, it's not yet clear that he will just go back to coalescing with the Islamists. If he does such a thing, then that's a definite suicide. But let us bear in mind that the Americans, the American special envoy, some of the European special envoys were in Khartoum only 48 hours ago. Mm-hmm. So we don't know if they have given Al-Burhan the green light or whether they just stipulated some conditions here and there. But I think what is at stake is the economic situation. The situation now is worsening. The living conditions are bad. There is an economic crisis, and there is a need for cash to come in. Already there are $3 billion coming from the World Bank, but it's not clear if the civilians now have the institutional capacity needed to prepare projects for such task. It's a very huge task.
Jonas, Al-Burhan made it clear that he wants to preserve the Juba agreement that was signed with the two key factions operating in Darfur and South Kordofan. But do you think that these factions will be willing to be part of an establishment when we know from the beginning they were always skeptical of the military junta? They saw them as reminiscent of the old order, and they were only encouraged when they said, you know what, perhaps with the civilians, Sudan would be a different country to live in.
Well, speaking with essentially all of the commanders who'd signed on to the agreement back during the talks in Juba, what I found was, a set of gentlemen who were in many ways much more concerned about ending up on the side of the winner. There was real concern that the civilians had the strength and capacity and wherewithal to actually deliver this transition. And in many ways, as you've seen with the split of the Forces Freedom and Change and Sudan Revolutionary Front just 2 or 3 weeks ago, you've seen the finance minister and head of the Justice and Equality Movement, Jibril Ibrahim, and Mini Minawi of the Sudan Liberation Army take off in their own direction and ostensibly in the direction of the military, because they feel that were they to be faced with the sort of elections and open, test of their popularity that the transition is meant to create, that they would lose very badly, that they would not be competitive candidates. And so they have decided to, rather than standing behind the sorts of values that put them in the bush fighting against the government for 20 years or so, they've decided to hew much more closely towards the military, who they do see as much more likely to be able to deliver them a more sustained run at power.
Alex, it was quite obvious for quite some time in Sudan that the military establishment is trying to co-opt the elite, to bribe tribal leaders, to try to influence the decision-making process in the country. But to what extent that could be helpful in the near future? We're talking about a country that has been beset for decades and decades by instability and dictatorship.
Well, that was absolutely the method that was used by Omar al-Bashir to stay in power. We call it the political marketplace, just buying off the provincial elites, the tribal elders, the militia commanders, rebel leaders, etc., etc. And Mini Minawi and Jibril Ibrahim were also players in this game. And yes, I'm sure that is what Al-Burhan is going to try and do in the short term. But he faces not only the problem that he cannot buy off the international community and he cannot buy off the street, but also there are the two most significant rural provincial armed groups, the Sudan Liberation Movement of Abdul Wahid al-Nur in Darfur, and the SPLM North of Abdulaziz al-Hillu in the Nuba Mountains in South Kordofan. They had not yet bought into the Juba Agreement. And there's a very real risk that the active armed conflict with these two groups will resume at scale. So al-Burhan is actually not only risking the entire democratic transition, but he's also jeopardizing the completion of an incomplete peace process in Kordofan and Darfur.
I have very few questions left. Walid, first of all, and briefly, if you don't mind, those moderate civilians who had hopes that this could be conducive to a genuine democracy in Sudan, when they saw what happened, when they saw what they described as a betrayal by the army chief, do you think that this could lead them to more of an aggressive stance in the near future?
I believe that the elites are going to maintain the peaceful tactics attempted against the Sudanese dictator Omar al-Bashir and now against al-Burhan. However, my fear some comes from the fact that people are already out in the streets and they are adamantly against this coup d'etat. And should things worsen, there is going to be a confrontation which may lead to some bloodshed. Imagine, I mean, during June of 2019, at the sit-in, some 1,800 protesters were killed. Now, we're not talking about a protest in a very concise place. We're talking about a protest, a nationwide protest. And I think that
right.
I just pray to God that things won't go to this extent.
Jonas, the army is not a cohesive entity in Sudan. You have the professional soldiers, you have those who were loyal to the al-Bashir, you have Hemeti, who is widely considered as an outsider. And do you think that this institution itself will be able to move forward united under the command of al-Burhan for as long as it takes?
I think the current dispensation and certainly the events of the last few weeks have been incredibly short-sighted. They're based all on very short-term interests. Once those short-term interests do not serve the stakeholders who are party to them anymore, they will have to go on a new hunt for new partners. So I think those divisions are destined to bite the military back ultimately. And I think one underappreciated component here and a catalyst for today's events really was Egypt's integral role in bringing the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudan Armed Forces back together in early June. The forces were very close to battle themselves inside Khartoum.
Alex, this is exactly the dream that al-Burhan and the TMC was trying to sell to the people of Sudan. Under our control, if you go along with us for the transitional period, we will offer peace, stability, and we will be a much stronger nation for the near future. Those people who saw what happened with those announcements, do you think that they will feel that everything has been completely shattered, leaving the country in a total limbo?
I think al-Burhan's credibility is at an all-time low. He really doesn't speak with the authority of a man who can be trusted or a man who commands the political landscape. And one's hope in the coming weeks is that actually the military, having shown its hand, it will be unable to accomplish any of the tasks that it has promised for itself, and the revolutionary aspirations of those Sudanese Democrats of 2 years ago can at last be fulfilled. That the revolution can be accomplished, and the military can be reduced to its much smaller, proper role in Sudanese society.
And this is all happening when the African Union has been basically saying that it was hoping that to silence guns and to put an end to a long era of military coups and dictatorship in that continent. But it seems that we have to wait and perhaps it's going to be a long way to go before we see more peaceful civilian governments prevailing in the part of the world. Walid Madibo, Jonas Hona, Alex de Wolf, thank you very much for your insight and looking forward to talking to you in the near future. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, for further discussion. Go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashim Ahl Barra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.